Hello, can you hear me? Hi, Brent, can you hear me?
I can, Marie. Can you hear me?
I am so sorry. I'm having technical problems on my end. I could not get my personal laptop to work, so I had to switch to the work computer. I'm so sorry. I meant to be logged on sooner.
All right,
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine
Well, good.
so far.
I'm very surprised we don't already have a bunch of people here. It makes me a little concerned because normally there would be a lot of people, and I know there's a lot of interest in this talk. Hi, Lonnie, can you hear us?
Yes.
Hi, Trish.
Hi. Yeah, we can hear you. It said this time, it said the meeting starts at 7, so that may be why people are slower joining.
Well, it's exactly the same meeting we've had every time.
Yes.
So, and it's set up so people can join ahead of me.
Yeah, which was nice.
So I don't know what's going on here.
It's probably
I mean,
the top.
No, it's not. Our entire board is very
Well,
interested in
You
your
still
talk.
you have 6 minutes to find another one.
Oh my God. We have our board meeting right before this.
Ah,
And Julie Duggins was talking about, oh, here we go.
that can be deadly.
Talking about how this is absolutely classic Florida archaeology, and we're all very excited about it. It's making me think it's something I did. But Lonnie, you were able to get in, right?
Yeah, we got in without trouble. Lonnie's getting a little food here and there.
Yeah, that's the problem with our board meeting. Yeah, this is definitely making me feel like I did something wrong. Check my email and see if there should be a bunch of people on already. What have I done? I have a bunch of people like pre-register for it. So I know that there are people that are wanting to join. Oh, for heaven's sake, it's already. Oh, it's P2.
Oh, whoops, now I've muted her.
Oh, I can unmute myself though, because I'm a
There we go.
co-host. Okay. Yeah, and I'm trying to get speaker view only for when I record this. Okay, I will begin with the introductions. I will start out by saying, as part of my job, we recently have started trying to catalog our paper archives. And in the process of that, I began working on records that some of the records we had for years, and others, when our speaker retired from his position at the University of South Florida, he delivered some more boxes of archives. And I have been going through each and every piece of paper in those archives and became very interested in this amazing site that Brent was very involved in excavating. I believe led to your dissertation. Is that correct? You were working on your dissertation at the time?
No, actually, my dissertation was based on Seminole Indian studies.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay.
Chris Kimball would know something about that. This was actually a project after I'd finished my doctorate.
Okay, so you already had your PhD in
Yeah,
there.
I was a full-fledged, piled high and deeper by the time I started.
Well ahead of my husband, who finished years after you, even though you went to school together. But anyway, so he worked on this amazing site called Big Springs, and I mean the detail of the records is amazing. Brent kept every scrap of paper, every single field note that he did, that his crew did. So incredible detail. So I thought as I was going through this, what a great opportunity to ask him to present to past, because a lot of our members might not be familiar. You know, I'm sure they've all heard of it, but how familiar are they with the archaeology of it? Chris is holding up some paperwork that he has. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I asked Brent to do it, and he just immediately said yes, he would do it. And I was kind of flabbergasted. I thought I would have to beg and plead, but he was very amenable. So anyway, a little background about Brent. He's, as I mentioned, retired professor emeritus from the University of South Florida. Went to University of Florida, and also worked for the Bureau of Archaeological Research while he was doing this project under Jim Miller. And there's just some great correspondence between them, and mutual respect you can see from the correspondence that went on there. But at any rate, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Weisman, and hopefully get a good recording of this, because everybody's asking me, want to make sure that we get a good recording of this. So
Okay.
without further ado,
Here we
Dr.
go.
Weisman.
All right. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, go.
You ready?
Okay. Can everybody see the screen? I guess.
Yes,
Marie-
they can't hear
Okay.
you, but
They're
yes,
not gonna
you're
be able to hear me,
perfect.
but- Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if there's a way that we can determine if they can hear me or not, since they're muted, but
Yes, I'm sure, yes, they can.
they would.
Yes, they're
complain to you-
nodding, they can hear you.
Yeah, they would complain to you in some way, I think. if
Yeah,
they
and I'm
couldn't
glad
hear
you
me.
mentioned that. People
So,
can go
yeah.
ahead and use the chat function to
Okay.
communicate with me, because I'm going to mute myself as well.
Okay. I want to thank Marie for inviting me to do this presentation. As she said, I have a tendency to say yes, and then the next day wonder about the wisdom of doing that, and go through all kinds of fear and disturbance about agreeing to do something. And this project was more than 30 years ago. And to be honest, I haven't thought a great deal about it over the years since then. I've done lots of projects, lots of work in the years subsequent to that. And it's always a scary thing to go back to something you did long ago and look at what you've written, and the fear is, did I really write that? Did I really think that? And but it turned out to be, and again, thanks to Marie for presenting this, a very positive experience, because I went back, I reread the book that I wrote on this project. It was published in 1992. I looked back and I found some of the slide images that had been scanned by my students at USF some years back. So in the way of an apology, what you're going to be seeing are scanned, very old slide images, not exactly the quality that we would expect today, but that's the best I could do. Anyway, looking at the images, reading the book again, I actually was very impressed. And as Marie said, the level of documentation and the care and the scrutiny that we used during the excavations, I was actually beginning to wonder if maybe I had peaked in 1989 and done some of my best work then. But nonetheless, it was a very rewarding experience. As it turned out, I was able to make some connections that I hadn't made before. And so I kind of got reinvigorated in thinking about mission archaeology. And so the first question I want to ask and answer is why were we there? Why were we at the Fig Springs site? And we have to go back in time a bit. And I'm going back to when I was a young teenager many years ago, hanging around at New Smyrna Beach in part of my summers. And when I wasn't surfing or causing juvenile delinquency around town, I was exploring the sites, Turtle Mound and Castle Windy and other archaeological and historic sites in the area, the lighthouse and so forth. And came across the ruins of the New Smyrna sugar mill, which was overgrown, not interpreted to the extent that it is today. And it was clear, however, because the signage said it was a sugar mill. The roadside markers said sugar mill, and it seemed obvious looking at it with the cauldrons and so forth, that it was a sugar mill. But it was located on Mission Road. So I was thinking, well, Mission, where's the Mission? Mission Road, sugar mill. Then later on that summer, I discovered a postcard in the local curio shop that showed a picture of the sugar mill ruins, calling it Lost Spanish Mission, dated 1690. So then I realized, as I got into the history a little bit, that there had been a popular or perhaps promoted misconception about the sugar mill ruins along the St. John's Basin as perhaps being remnants of the Spanish missions. And of course, people knew that there had been missions in Florida, but where were they? And there was somewhat of a historical inferiority complex in the sense that Texas had missions with standing ruins, the Southwest, beautiful standing ruins, California with the missions that became major tourist attractions, and Florida's missions were earlier. But where were they? Well, of course, we all know that they were not above ground. They were, you had to go to the ground to find them and go under the ground to find them. And so in the 40s, well, 30s, 40s, and 50s, dedicated historians and archaeologists in Florida, in their own way, piecemeal, with their own pet projects, began to explore, look around for the archaeological remains of these early Florida missions. Mark Boyd was one of the first. We have John Griffin with the Florida Park Service, Hale Smith at FSU, Clarence Simpson, John Goggin, then Calvin Jones with the state, as you all know, Calvin. In their own way, they began picking around, looking around for the archaeological remains of the missions, and had success. They were able to find them, excavate portions of them, but their objectives mostly were to sort of define what these missions look like archaeologically, what kinds of pottery we would find, what kinds of Spanish majolica and Spanish artifacts would be associated with them, to date those objects, to confirm that they were in fact missions. And they, as I said, had some success, but it didn't, one project didn't really build on another. There wasn't sort of this impetus or this inertia to move things forward in any kind of real coordinated way. That wasn't really to come until the 1980s, which is kind of strange. And I know we have Rochelle in the audience, and she has a long history with missions and has a perspective on the archaeology too. But the way I see it and the way I put it together is that we ended up with missions, but we started off with looking for DeSoto, and that happened because of our former governor, Bob Graham. And imagine a governor who has a true interest in Florida history, what that was like. And so many of us remember those days with fondness. And Bob Graham and his family took a trip out west. They see the Lewis and Clark Trail prominently marked along the way. And he returns to Florida thinking, well, we have kind of a Florida version of Lewis and Clark. We have Hernando de Soto. Now, of course, the analog there isn't perfect by any means, but we had somebody of historical importance, moving through Florida, something that was marker worthy if we could only find the trail to do this. And there had been obviously attempts with John Swanton and others over the years to identify the trail, but the archaeological aspect of it was indefinite, pretty nebulous, not exactly sure if you were going to put markers on the highway, which highways would those be. So Bob Graham goes to the Park Service, and I know we have Dana he's a longtime Park Service person. you may have some recollection of some of these events. Bob Graham goes to the Park Service, finds a very receptive Park Service director, Nay Landrum. Was a great guy. And they toss around some ideas, and Bob Graham, of course, moves on to other things as politicians and statesmen have to do. And Nay Landrum makes some money available to Chase DeSoto. And that money goes to University of Florida because that's Bob Graham's alma mater, and his mentor is there, Mike Gannon, and Mike Gannon and Jerry Milanich are in tight with each other. So some money comes to UF, to the Florida Museum, and the search for DeSoto begins with Jerry putting some students in the field, and having some success finding DeSoto enough to justify putting markers in along the highways going from the area of Inverness in Citrus County all the way up to Tallahassee, and Nay Landrum persisting in the part of the project that involved finding the missions. So the DeSoto quest and the mission quest were kind of rolled into one. And Jerry put survey crews out in northern Florida looking for DeSoto sites, but it turns out that DeSoto and some of the missions were in close proximity to each other. So one of his, at that time, grad students, Ken Johnson, ended up looking at what John Goggin had done in 1949 at a place called Fig Springs. There we have, this is from John Goggin's personal scrapbook, which is now at the University of Florida Library, showing Goggin and some of his students in Fig Springs collecting Spanish and Indian materials from the clear spring water. They have buckets there with glass bottoms. And you can see on the right-hand image, the students leaning over those buckets, using them like big scuba masks, looking at the bottom of the springs, picking up lots of olive jar, majolica, some other Spanish objects of Spanish origin, lots of native objects as well, all mixed in, but in the water. So Goggin goes up the hill, digs around a little bit in the woods, doesn't find much, but it's enticing enough for Ken Johnson and his crew to return to the site, not to mention that one of the DeSoto sites was supposedly nearby or perhaps even on this same location. So Ken put a couple of test pits in. They find what turned out to be a clay floor, portions of a clay floor, baked clay, and in another test unit, portions of a human skeleton. At that point, they went on to other projects, but his finds were enticing enough for Jim Miller and Jerry Milanich to put their heads together and begin to think about how this site could be further investigated. Now, this was in 1986, 87, when these conversations were taking place. San Luis, if I remember correctly, was purchased in 1984, maybe 83 by the state. And it hadn't been fully interpreted yet. It was still being, the early stages of the archaeology. There was this might be a little bit of a surprise, there was some conversation about which site should receive the full interpretation. Should Fig Springs turn out to be the real thing? Should it be Fig Springs, which is in Ichetucknee Springs State Park, or should it be San Luis? Now, we all know what the outcome of that conversation was, but there was a period of time when money and effort and commitment was available to explore the Fig Springs site with the idea that it may receive some level of public interpretation. So that's where I come into the picture. I was an employee of Jim's at BAR, and Jim and Jerry decided I was the right person for the job. And so out we go to do this project. I was given pretty much free rein to do it as I saw fit. Luckily for me, I had a strong friendship with Gary Shapiro, and the old timers in the audience here will remember Gary, I hope, as fondly as I do. He was a great help to me in conceptualizing how you go about investigating on a large scale a mission site. And we had about 30 acres here that I thought would probably contain the site. I knew where Ken had worked, and we knew that that was going to be part of the site, but I wanted to, as much as possible, capture within our archaeological grid the entire community. So here you see in our early stages, our crew out there with the old auger and the box and transit set up in the background there. This is basically the same approach that Gary used at San Luis, I think very, very effectively. We gridded off 30 acres in 10-meter squares. And at every 10-meter, at the corner of every 10-meter box, we did an auger hole and we did a topographical shot with the goal of making very detailed contour maps showing both artifact contours, distribution of the artifacts of different types as it related to the topography of the site. Now, I think all of us at some point in our early lives come across images that become sort of personally iconic. They become, we internalize them, we absorb them, they become sort of templates for how we then turn around and visualize the world. This is one of my iconic images. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It's the John White watercolor showing the village of Secaton. And it was first published in the United States. This is in the British Museum in a Life magazine article in 1947 as a preview of a book that was about to come out called The New World by Stéphane Laurent, in which he published most of the color paintings from John White in addition to the Lemoyne or the Lemoyne debris engravings. Now, somebody in my family had the foresight of keeping the Life magazine issue. And in the early 50s, I came across it. I became fascinated with what was going on here in this picture. And it sure looked like a more interesting place than where I lived. And I wanted to transport myself, time travel, and go into this picture and walk around and peek into these houses and sit around that circle and see what was going on. Of course, much later, I realized that's what anthropologists do. So I chose the right career eventually, but this became sort of my template for looking at Fig Springs. I wanted to look at this on the community level and understand how the different parts of the site fit together archaeologically. How could I approach the site stratigraphically to tie all the different pieces together? And of course, that means, first of all, broad scale survey to try to enclose within the boundaries of our survey grid the community. So we made a series of maps showing what the lay of the land looked like. On the left center, where you see the contour lines coming very closely together there, is the bank leading right into Fig Springs itself, the body of water where Goggin collected. That linear feature that goes from the lower left to the diagonally across the middle of the frame is a phosphate rail bed. And we were very fortunate that the phosphate mining and exploration in what is now Tuckney State Park took place in other locations besides the mission. They did put this tramway across that it turned out not to have really disturbed any of the deposits, amazingly. But you can walk around Tuckney Springs now and see some of the holes that the phosphate mining made in those days, which of course compare nothing to what phosphate mining has become in the industrial age more recently. So this was a topographical map that we made, again, using all of our shots and showing us basically the lay of the land. Then a graphic picture of that same grid showing densities of Aboriginal artifacts. And this was instead of just showing contour lines, I took it a little bit more artistically here and shaded in these blobs to show the different densities and concentrations of Aboriginal artifacts that we came up with in the auger survey. And you can see that toward the lower left, there's lots of density of Aboriginal pottery. And then there's, as you move to the center and to the north, things open up a little bit, not quite as dense. And after we had done some subsequent testing and actually some of the excavations, this is how we then took that same bird's eye view and began to place names on the different deposits, the archaeological signatures of these different areas, which we're going to get into in more detail in a moment. At the top, you can see the convento area, which is where the priest would have lived. There's a cemetery just to the south of that, the mission itself adjacent to the cemetery, then a plaza area, which was basically empty or clean or devoid of artifacts. And then those units in the bottom of the image show where the Aboriginal structure was as we defined it. I'll have more to say about these as we go along. And I will be criticizing some of my own interpretations, which is a privilege you get after 30 some years of hiatus when you're between looking at these things. So one of the things I wanted to do was open up all parts of the site at the same time, not just do one and then move to not just do the convento, then move to the church, then move to the Aboriginal area, et cetera. I wanted to get excavations going simultaneously across the entire site so that I could begin to build a master stratigraphic profile of how the different parts fit together. So here you can see, here's in the lower right-hand corner, the excavator with a very dark soil, and then we have some lighter soil in the center, and then the church and the top of the frame with the white soil up there. So as we're working along here, I am continually sort of improving, upgrading, critiquing my own interpretations of what was going on and how these different parts of the site fit together. Now we decided to, once I had a basic understanding of what was going on here and the layout, to focus on the church first. And here we have the church signature, which is this red clay floor, this red clay deposit. And we spent a lot of time very carefully excavating this and mapping it in. I liked to use very large units so that we could see the relationship of finds, of artifacts, of features to each other quickly. So we worked in these very large units, as you see here, and came up with luckily, because there had been opportunity for disturbance, we came up with considerable architectural remains of this church or chapel or visita, however you might want to phrase it. But here's a large railroad tie type log, which had been hewn and shaped, that I think was a threshold for the building. And you can see two of my crew members there, Keith Terry and Brack Barker, mapping this. And that's probably some of the documentation that Marie was talking about, is what they're working on right there, carefully mapping basically everything we found, because I realized the site was undisturbed. It was absolutely intact, except for the few test pits that Ken Johnson had put in. Goggin wasn't successful in finding anything, and his approach was more random across the surface, so he didn't cause any disturbance. So I realized that this was a very fragile site. You can see how close it is to the surface. It was intact. This may be the final time, the only time it would be excavated. We were there with the expectation we were going to reveal significant architectural remains, because remember, the public interpretation of this was still up in the air. It was still possible. This still could have been a contender. So I know that those of you that have done field work know how valuable a good crew is. And it becomes a real team project, real teamwork. And you, as the project director, you learn to listen to your excavators. You learn to trust their observations, and you bring them fully into the excavation of the site, which I think that some of the documentation Marie was talking about is the daily field records I required them to keep. A daily field log that was not their personal journal, but was meant to be contributed to the archive. And those observations, every night I would read through them and adjust my own tactics and go back the next day with questions, or ask them to clarify something or show me what they meant. And that was an extremely productive way to move forward with this project. Not going to show very well as a slide or as an image. This is a figure from the publication that shows that same portion of that same sort of railroad tie threshold in the bottom image. Some of the burned boards, it turned out we determined that it had a board wall, like fence boards, but stood on their end. It was a board wall that abutted up against this heavy wooden threshold. We even were able to find the burned, charred, semi-petrified mud dauber nests that had once been attached to the rafters of the building. That's what you see in the bottom there, and in the upper right. The upper left was a stone pipe, not a very good image of it, but a smoking pipe or ceremonial pipe, I don't know, that was carved out of limestone, that was also found at the site. So I became rather obsessed with the stratigraphy of the church, and was able to understand the behavior behind the construction. And how it started out was the laborers stripped off the existing topsoil. They then applied a layer of clean white sand that was shaped into like a low, very low platform mound, a very low tapered mound of sand. On that white sand, they placed this red soil that you can see here at the top, with these clay, hardened clay pads spaced around the floor to support the roof timber, to support the roof posts, the posts that held up the roof. And then there was clear and strong evidence that the structure had burned down. Then there was a clean layer of sand placed over the burned church. So we had cleaning of topsoil, we had building of small white mound, we had application of red soil prepared clay to hold up these support posts. Then we had another layer of clean sand placed over the entire thing after it burned. So like I became obsessed with the stratigraphy. I thought it was really cool that we were able to figure this out in something that looks so superficial. It looked just like a surface find, but with our very careful work going through the stratigraphy here, I decided that I wanted to have a graphic artist depict basically that same stratigraphy that we just saw in the previous image. And this was a much larger, almost a poster-sized graphic that he produced for me, so it doesn't reproduce very well at this scale. But when it came time to do the book, I wanted to use it as the cover. Now, University Press, they have a very talented art department, and they've worked on a number of my books and others. They do a great job with the cover illustrations. In this case, however, they wanted to put archaic stemmed points on the cover of the book, and the first draft of the cover that I saw had these stemmed points, which had no bearing at all on what was inside the book. I wanted that graphic depiction to be on the cover. And so they yielded to me, but I think they also decided they were going to make it as sort of day glow, phosphorescent, neon, unsightly as possible to sort of, I'm not going to say spite, because they're good-hearted people and good artists, but I think that they sort of begrudgingly acceded to my wish to put that image on the cover, but they used these really strange, these strange day glow kinds of colors. Years later, when I got all the manuscript back and all the original photos and so forth that the press turned back to me, and I got that larger poster size graphic image back that they had used to make the cover, there was a yellow sticky tab still on the poster from the artist that said, "I can't believe he wanted to use this as the cover." So that sort of tipped me off that I had gotten in the way of their artistic creativity. However, the book came out in 1992. Several years later, those same spear points were used on the cover of Jerry Malanich's pre-Columbian archaeology book. So they made use of them, as it turned out anyway. So this is what we think that church building looked like. Open air, small, not real permanent, thatched roof. You can see the roof support posts there. And the floor, we also determined, was sloped from the back of the building out toward the front, so that if you were standing out in the uncovered area, you would be standing lower than the priest who was conducting the rituals inside this covered building. Then we focused on the Aboriginal structure here. It was very complicated stratigraphy, lots and lots of features. I think we had perhaps more than 100 features. These were not including post holes, which were treated separately, not as features. So most of these were pits of various kinds. I developed a typology of the pits. They were cob-filled pits that were probably for smudging. They were were trash-filled pits, there were hearths, there were different kinds of pits here. And what I'm showing here, and I was never able to really decide or to my own satisfaction how big or what shape this building was. Pretty sure it wasn't circular. The church, we figured was about 10.5 meters by 8.5 meters. This structure, looking at these post holes that you can see here in plan view and others that are not shown in this particular figure, perhaps was about 9 meters by 14 meters. So not big, nothing on the scale of the San Luis Council House or anything like that, but very intensively used. And what you see there in the upper center is a dog burial, which was kind of a strange thing to see. And it's right along the roof line, maybe just under the eaves of the structure. We're gonna look at that again in a minute, but here's some of the profiling we did and sectioning of the features. So our strategy, of course, which I think is everyone's strategy with features, is to section them, excavate a portion of them so that you can really see what's going on, that you can define the feature better. We kept at least half of the features for water screening or flotation, which we'll talk about later, but these were just chock full, so rich, so much, both artifacts and plant and animal remains in these features. It was just incredible. Here's one that John Worth, the famous John Worth, was actually a student here on this project. For one of the seasons, I took on a University of Florida field school. So in addition to my paid laborers, my paid workers, my paid excavators, I should say, I had field school students. John Worth was one of those. And I put him on this feature here, and it was pretty complex, extremely rich. And here's what part of that looked like, with ash and a post going through it, a hearth and fill, and just chock full of material. Here's the dog burial. You can see the head against the pedestal there, and the rest of the skeleton toward the bottom. Again, I apologize for the quality of the slides because of the images, because again, they are scanned slides from old slides. So not the greatest, but you can see the dog burial there. I had Irv Quitmeyer from the Florida Museum come out and look at it. He brought some comparative material. It turned out to be about the size of a German Shepherd. Other than that, I can't really say. We didn't notice any sort of mutilation, cut marks, anything on the skeleton that indicate that the dog had been sacrificed or anything like that. So, and here it is in the Aboriginal structure. No artifacts with it. Not sure what to make of it, other than it was very intentionally buried. We could see the burial pit very clearly. So what was I doing when the students and my excavators were all busily screening and shoveling and pushing wheelbarrows and fighting mosquitoes? I was taking notes. So here I am. Some of these are what Marie now is dealing with. Again, realizing the importance of documentation here. This remains to this day, the best documented Timucuan mission archaeologically. So I know that Rochelle and the San Luis folks and people have done extremely detailed work out there with the Appalachee. Timucua, not so much. So, and there's been some good work over on the coast, and of course David Hurst Thomas and so forth, excellent work over there as well. But in between those two areas, between the coast and St. Augustine and Tallahassee, with this big area of Timucua, the sites are known. Ken Johnson found a few. in addition to this one. But in terms of the level of archaeology, we were able to work here for 16 months straight without interruption. And the funding was constant, it's steady, it kept coming. And when I talked to my academic colleagues, yeah, I was able to work there for 16 months. They couldn't believe it because, you know, they're used to a month or two in the summers at best. And so how many of those would it take to equal 16 months of continuous field work? But it makes a big difference in terms of just the continuity of it. And not to mention that the site is fragile. The longer you're going to leave it, the more damage is going to occur. So we were blessed with the continued support of Jim Miller at the Bureau and at that time DNR, Department of Natural Resources, who kept supporting us, even though at some point along the line, despite what you've seen there in terms of the architectural remains, the decision was made to basically turn all the interpretive resources to San Luis. And that wasn't a mistake. That was a very solid decision. And San Luis has a lot of interpretive potential, and it's in the right place. It's in Tallahassee. This is in the middle of the woods at Ichetucknee Springs State Park, a long way from nowhere. So I'm not faulting that decision at all, but and I'm very grateful that the Park Service kept up their support for us even after that was done. So some of the bigger themes here, the bigger pictures, some of the things I've had a chance to think about since the project was completed all those years ago. It's really the story of a community that was created and a community that was transformed. And the agent of that transformation was a priest, a single priest. I know it's different at San Luis where you had a civilian population, you had some militia out there, but for the Timucua missions, you had one guy, one friar living out there by himself, not supported by the military, not armed, not leading by force or threat really, or terror, but leading through sort of the force of his spirit. And no matter what we think today about the overall impact of the Christianizing the natives and the disease that came and all the negatives, which are undisputed, we can't impugn the sacrifice and the dedication that these individuals took on when they became these priests out in the middle of nowhere. And so however begrudgingly, we have to show them our respect for what they did. And they had to not only carry the word of God with them and try to convert the Indians, but they also had to have a huge amount of practical experience in architecture, in planting, in community organizing, a political sense of what they needed to do to stay in good favor with the crown, because that was always an issue, and also not to lose their heads to the communities in which they lived, which did, of course, happen with the Wali missions on the coast. So these guys were in a delicate situation, unsung in many cases, don't know their life stories for many of them, but their job was to convert in two ways, to convert the natives to Christianity and therefore make them Spanish citizens, which they were very sincere and earnest in doing, and to convert them into peasants, to make them Christian peasants and subjects of Spain so that they could be producing resources and surplus to help the colony the Spanish colony of La Florida stay afloat. So that's what they were here to do. If you notice back here, there's a trunk, a chest in the lower left-hand illustration there with a lock on that chest. We found such a lock at in the convento area, which is one of the reasons why I called that the convento, with some other Spanish material up there. So we did have some evidence of the priest there. We also saw undisputed evidence of the effects of his work in Christianizing the Indians. Here's one of the burials you can see there. The church is underneath the black plastic. This is just outside of the walls there. The burials were in rows. We excavated only 11 of them. We didn't remove them from the ground. We just wanted to confirm, to make sure that we were dealing with a cemetery, an organized cemetery. We cleaned the skeletal remains. We recorded them very, very carefully, and we then backfilled them. In some cases, and the skeletal remains were actually in very good shape. They were not nearly as decomposed as many Aboriginal skeletal remains are in these sandy areas of North Florida. In some cases, we had burials on top of burials. There were no coffins, maybe some shrouds. We did have a few pins here and there. Almost no, unlike what we see like at St. Catherine's with David Hurst Thomas's work, almost no artifacts of any kind, no religious medallions, no glass beads, etc., with these burials. So we only did 11 to confirm kind of the size and shape of the cemetery, its organization. And there you see one of the skeletal remains there, which is buried in a Christian position, laying flat on the back, fully extended. The photograph here doesn't show it very well, but the arms were folded across the chest in a sort of praying or clasping position, which is very typical of a Christian burial. So we know that our priest here had been effective in Christianizing the Indians, perhaps even at death, what became called the harvest of souls, because it really turned out not to matter when they were Christianized, if they could count them as Christians. That's what that mattered. So we have a harvest of souls going on here. We have some also religious artifacts. These were actually found in the Aboriginal structure. What you see there on the right is it's pure gold. And I'll have to say, I don't know, I don't think I'm bragging, but I've found, I think, gold in 3 other Florida excavations over the years. I'm not sure how many other terrestrial archaeologists in Florida can claim that, but this was a pure gold. We could see the file marks on it. It was a religious medallion. If you look at it closely, you'll see the letter A, and then over top of the letter A is the letter M. So it's Ave Maria with a crown of thorns. It's part of the Mother Mary cult that the Spanish Catholics used throughout the New World to help Christianize the Indians, not only here in Florida in the Southwest, but of course in Mexico as well. We have those images still in place today and worshipped. So this was an example of that. We could, again, you could see the file marks and the craftsmanship on making this thing. Not very big, as you can see from the scale there, but years after the excavation, it happened to be in the Gray building in Tallahassee. I don't remember why I was there, but I accompanied a tour group of dignitaries, politicians perhaps, I'm not sure who it was. I was tagging along with them. And we went into the vault. Marie will know about the vault. It's been years since I've been in the Gray building, so I'm not sure if it exists there anymore or what. But I went into the vault, and the leader of the group, who was an employee of BAR, showed this object to the group, and this person said, he will remain anonymous, that he wasn't sure how this came into the collection or why it was there, because it looked like it came out of a bubblegum machine. Now, I kept my tongue. I didn't say, well, let me tell you, I actually excavated this from an early 17th century site. I can tell you exactly where it came from and so forth. I didn't say anything.
Oh my God.
So hopefully it's still safe somewhere in BAR. But next to it, you see another, it's a gilded cap to a bead like you would have in a rosary. So these were coming not from the church, but from what we call the Aboriginal structure, not from the cemetery. Here's other images showing more sophisticated, perhaps, depictions of the crown of thorns and Mother of Mary, the Mother of Mary cult. It spread throughout the hemisphere, used very effectively. Here's some from St. Catherine's that David Hurst Thomas excavated from burials within the church there. So you can see the same thing going on. So the conversion to Christianity was taking place. It seemed to be pretty effective. We have a lot of glass beads that came from the site. My one regret in the publication is that the beads there were shown in black and white, so the full effect it wasn't available. But here we can see some gilded beads at the top that were probably part of a rosary, and more of the typical early to mid 17th century drawn blue beads in the center, couple of wire wound beads and chevron beads at the bottom, and of course glass beads to the historical archaeologist are something that people obsess about. There's bead clubs, there's bead conferences, there's bead publications. There's been a sort of a continuing love affair with categorizing, classifying glass beads, which I did in the appendix to the book, using one of the accepted taxonomies. But the more interesting thing to me about the glass beads, most of which came from the Aboriginal structure, again, not from the church, not from the convento, is the fact that I think John Worth later on in his scholarship came across the idea. It wasn't an idea, he came across some documentation indicating that glass beads were used as payment for labor. So the chiefs going to St. Augustine as part of this labor tribute that they were required to produce with corn were rewarded, they were paid for with glass beads. They would then take the glass beads back to their village and distribute them opportunistically based on who they wanted to favor, who did the most work, who was related to them, whatever. They had probably their own hierarchy of how they gave the beads out. But when I realized that, that gave me a whole different perspective on understanding the role of these beads actually in the society at the time, not just as decorative items, not just as something to be classified and dated by the archaeologists, but something that was really used in a dynamic economic system. And of course, because these beads, for the most part, were manufactured in Italy or in other places in Europe and came over here with some kind of value attached to them and end up buried in the ground in the middle of Timucua province and valued by the people here, that brings the people here into some kind of a global network, a global economic network. So we can see clear evidence in the early 1600s here in Florida of globalization, the processes of globalization taking place. That's the perspective that I came to appreciate these beads with. We also found a ring with an amethyst set in it. And I probably should not have had one of our crew members model it, but I did want to see what size finger this would fit on. It did slip off of her finger, and it is now safely in the collection. But Again, that was also came from the same area. So evidence of the second part of the priest's change is the priest as agent of change, converting the natives into peasants. As Jerry titled one of his books, Laboring in the Fields of the Lord. And I think actually that's probably his best book in my view. I suggest that you guys get a hold of that if you haven't looked at it already. He talks about the Fig Spring site in there, but the title is Laboring in the Fields of the Lord. And here we have iron hoes that were used. Here on the left is it in situ. In the right is its conserved version as done by Jamie Levy and the staff at BAR. Clearly it was a hoe used for agricultural purposes, probably also used as a hammer and perhaps as a weapon, perhaps as an adze, a multi-purpose tool, but clearly its primary purpose was to hoe fields, to produce crops. And one of the crops to produce, of course, was corn, because corn was part of the tribute system that had to move to St. Augustine. We found lots of features with corn cobs in them. Many of them were probably used for smudging purposes to keep mosquitoes away because of the shape of the pits. They were sort of bell-shaped, which would produce smoke, not flames. And of course, the corn came into the Timucuans prior to the Spaniards coming here. But I think, even though I can't really quantify it, I think with the numbers of cobs that we found, I could interpret that as being some evidence of intensification of corn production as being part of this larger economic system. Almost no, a few of the kernels or cupules, I think, but almost exclusively corn cobs. Lots and lots of artifacts coming out of those features. Here was water screening we set up in the field. You can see some majolica there that came out of the screens. Very, very rich features. And then we get to the question of who were these people? Who were these alleged Timucuans? And John Hand got on me a little bit about this and kind of read me the riot act a bit in his book on the Timucuan missions, because I suggested that perhaps the population itself was either absorbing or being replaced by, somehow accommodating natives from other areas, non-Timucuans, maybe from the areas of Georgia, just which isn't far geographically, maybe from Appalachia, maybe from the coast. And my evidence for that was in the pottery. Now, John said, well, the documents don't support that. The documents all the way through tell about the government officials or the military interacting with Timucuan chiefs, to which I would say that's probably true. The chiefs perhaps were always Timucuan, but it doesn't mean that the people themselves were the traditional Timucuans that we think about, or that were the people that DeSoto encountered earlier when he came through. To me, the pottery suggests a great amount of demographic instability and population movements. Here we have some very unusual pottery that John Goggin found some of this in the spring in his work, but we found this in situ in the Aboriginal area of the site. This is shell-tempered pottery in a mission context. And shell-tempered pottery does not occur in the Timucuan area of Florida. It's not part of the sequence. It's just odd. It comes in, it's an anomaly. And you can see that rim decoration there on the upper left piece. That's not coming out of any kind of native tradition here. But we also see cord marked. We have some cob marked pieces that are on this very clearly shell tempered pottery. John Worth wrote about it in the appendix in my book. He wrote about it in some detail. We named it the Goggins series because of its uniqueness. And the closest we could find comparable to this pottery is from the Dallas area of extreme northwest Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama. Up in that corner, there's a shell tempered pottery that resembles this. Now, how it got here, by whom, and when, exactly why, I don't know. But that's the evidence I was using. John Hand was, of course, nobody's going to dispute his skill using the documents. His evidence was different. And the idea is, as anybody who works with historical archaeology knows, what do you do when you have documents and archaeology that don't correspond? Do you cross one out? Do you weigh one more heavy than the other? Or do you somehow accommodate both views? I guess that's a decision that each archaeologist makes. I still think, because of the next slide I'm showing, there's more pottery from this area. This is not coming out of the Timucuan tradition. Those of you from Tallahassee, what would you say? Appalachia area, what would you say about this? And look at those appendages there. I mean, this is not coming from a Central Florida Timucuan prehistory that goes back through what we ended up calling the Swanee series, goes back through the Alachua tradition, Weeden Island, and so forth. This is different, and the paste is different. So what I ended up looking at, and what John and I ended up looking at, was really, this is more of a looking at the relationship between paste types, paste groupings, and how do you bring those paste groupings together in time. Now, the prehistoric Timucuan pottery, which we found in southern portions of the Aboriginal village, is sand tempered. We have the shell tempered pottery, and a lot of this pottery you see here is grit tempered or grog tempered. For the most part, it's grog tempered. So we have grog, we have shell, and we have sand. And when you look at them, they separate nicely out into different paste groups. And then we have the idea of how do we bring them together in a unified way to tell the story of the site. And to me, it looked like, okay, the sand tempered stuff was early. It's coming out of that same early tradition. Then we have two add-ons that are showing influence from elsewhere, and perhaps coming in by people moving in from elsewhere, the grog and the shell. And then the bigger question is, which I didn't think enough about at the time, but I'm thinking about now, is what does it mean when you shift paste selection, when you shift your paste categories? Because of course, paste is one of the key ingredients to ceramic technology. So you're talking about a technological shift from one way of making pottery to another. And does that mean your clay sources have shifted? Does that mean you're coming out of different traditions? These are all questions that, thanks to the prompting here of rethinking some of this thing, is now going through my mind. So further research will be called for. So do I have regrets? And I have not seen the time. I'm getting close to the end here. So thank you all for bearing with me. And of course, any archaeologist that has done excavation realizes that archaeology is a destructive enterprise, that you better do it right the first time, because no matter what you think about leaving a part of the site behind for others or whatever, you've destroyed that context that you're working in. There's really no going back. And with, when you're an enthusiastic archaeologist, you perhaps don't think about that to the extent that you should. But I do have some misgivings about the level of excavation that we did, even though it was sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity, to the extent that we were able to work in the 16 months I was talking about. And, I've worked a lot of projects since then and some long-term projects, but I've never, again, had that privilege of working a site that large for that long period of time, weighed against the fact that we essentially destroyed it. And so again, Marie, that's why you keep good records. I appreciate the fact that the Park Service has the spring, not Fig Springs, it's Mission Spring. You can see there on the Park Service brochure. They have some interpretation of the excavation of the archaeology of the mission in the visitor center at the south end, whenever that's open, which is very sporadically. And pre-COVID, they would occasionally take ranger-led bus tours out to the site and give some on-site interpretation. But the site itself and the public visibility of the site never really developed to the extent that was justified by the amount of destruction that took place there. So it's not like San Luis, where you can see these beautiful reconstructed buildings and this wonderful interpretation and all these publications. It's not like that. And to some extent, I have to take responsibility for not perhaps pushing harder at the time. I went on to other projects, and I took on other challenges and left this one behind. And, now second thoughts, perhaps that wasn't the right thing to do. I regret chainsawing down a Florida champion American holly tree that was in our sight line for one of our transects. And for those of you in the Park Service, I'm hereby making a public apology for doing that. One day at the site, a van load of Park Service biologists came out. I don't think Dana was in that group. He may have been. And they weren't there to look at the archaeology. I thought maybe they were. I was all excited to have this group out there. No, they had come out to look at some Florida champion American holly tree that was growing at the site. Well, I didn't know it. And they're looking all around for it. And finally it dawned on me that stump right underneath one of our sight lines, that big stump was the American holly. And finally they realized it too. So I'm stating publicly, sorry for sawing that tree down. Over the years, I've learned to be much more careful.
Oops.
And, yeah, oops. Yeah, that was a bad one. So yeah, so I'm sorry for that. Apologize for that. Some good things, though. In the book, when I reread it, I realized that what you didn't see in our site plan was a kitchen, and many of the mission sites that are known and have been excavated in other places have kitchens that have been identified. I was never confident, and I have a section in the book talking about this. I was never confident in identifying an area as the kitchen, and perhaps I ended up thinking perhaps it had been right on the edge of the terrace that had eroded down into the springs, and that's what contributed to the artifacts that Goggin had found down there. But so I'm happy about that. I'm also happy that various places in the book, I did say, well, the site, this was an active site for, I don't know, 40 years or so, perhaps, and things changed during time. It may not have been as static in its daily or yearly use as archaeology depicts it when we draw these neat lines around different site areas. So I was cautionary there about that. But the bigger question that I've had in more recent years, and this partly comes because I had a career at USF in Tampa, an academic career, which was in an applied anthropology department where I worked alongside of applied anthropologists who were working with living people. And one way or another, I was part of a team doing some archaeology, doing some oral history or whatever alongside of these. And I came to wonder, well, you know, it was just as Stephen Jay Gould would say, a historical contingency that there weren't living people at the Fig Spring site, that there weren't people there that we had to ask permission of to come to work there. You know, we just took it sort of upon ourselves that we had the right to go in there and excavate this site and excavate these skeletons. And you know, was that even existentially the right thing to do? And so, you know, I began to think, well, do archaeological sites have rights? You know, and there's a whole rights movement now, like bodies of water. Do bodies of water have rights? And that is a question that still kind of disturbs me. I think about it. I think about the role that archaeologists play in taking on the authority to excavate sites, particularly those that we didn't take the time in those years to ask anybody. There wasn't anybody there. We didn't have to ask permission. How different it would have been, perhaps, to go into a living village and say, what would you like to know about? Where could we do some excavation, some archaeology that might actually help your community, or that might actually inform your own ideas about your history? And in later years at USF, that's the kind of archaeology I started to do with the Seminole Indians and still do with them. So that wasn't quite my mindset at the time in the late 80s, but you know, as I matured over the years, and now as a retired person, I have the leisure of pondering these ideas. So that's it. And here's some books that those of you that might want to follow up. I mentioned each of these sources talks about Fig Springs, the excavations. Kathy Deegan's book, the top one there, came out before our work was finished or published. So she doesn't cite our excavations, but she talks about John Goggins' artifacts that came years earlier that ended up at the Florida Museum, that John studied and that she restudied, and that ended up naming some of the pottery types that you might be familiar with today: Fig Springs, Majolica, Columbia Plain. Columbia is named after Columbia County, where the site is located. So she talks about that. All the others there, John Hand, Bonnie McEwen, Jerry's book, mine, and John Worth, all give very, very good context to what I've been talking about, and also do mention the excavations, and give some different perspectives on them. So thank you very much. And for your attention. I hope some of you are still there. And if so, I'm happy to, because I have no way of seeing you, so I'm not talking to a
Yeah, you'll see them in a minute.
It's a little unusual. And I've seen lots of names popping up on the screen, so at least some of you haven't checked out. And
yeah,
so I'm happy to answer some questions for the remaining few minutes.
Let me figure this out just 1 second before I mute everybody. I'm gonna, because I'm president, I get to take the stand first and ask. I have a question, but first of all, thank you. That was excellent. It was so much fun for me to hear about it from your perspective, having looked through all those incredibly meticulous records that you kept. So thank you so very much for revisiting this. And it's very interesting hearing your perspectives now that you're retired and reflecting back. But the Ave Maria medallion is prominently on display at a $1 million expansion exhibit at the Museum of Florida History here in Tallahassee.
Oh, right, very good. I
And,
hope it's the right information.
Yeah,
did not-
well, yeah, I'm pretty sure it doesn't say it's from a bubblegum machine.
Okay. that's
But
good.
what's extremely interesting to me is since I went through these archives, I mean, I handled the loan for it, I guess, and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. But, you know, I really, there's so many illustrations of it in the archives. Recently, I've been going through images of the Spanish plate fleet artifacts for a couple of different reasons. And there is a medallion that is almost exactly the same.
Wow,
That
that's
came,
great.
and I don't know if it was 1715 or 1733. I'll have to go back and look and send you an image of that. And it
Wow.
was listed in our database as some unknown medallion. They didn't know what it was. And of course, now we know what it is because it's very similar to the one that you got at Big Springs.
Right.
But let me open it up to the floor because I am certain that, and I'm gonna, oops, 1 second here. I have brought something up on my screen now and I don't know how to get rid of it. I'm going to shoot. Why did that come up? I didn't want to do that. I don't want to share my screen. I wanted to make you not a co-host, remove co-host permissions. And hopefully I might have to get Rachel's help.
There she is.
Rachel,
Yes.
tell me, I stupidly co-hosted your father, and I might add him back just so that you can help me unmute everybody so they can ask questions.
People should be able to unmute if they click in their.
Oh,
phone.
okay, so people can just go ahead and unmute. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions.
Looks like it works.
There we go. Okay,
I'm hearing some people.
there we go. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Weisman? Marty?
Yeah, so those ceramics that you were talking about is, you know, archaeological evidence that conflicts with the documents that there might have been different, like non-Timucua people that were brought in. Like, you know, my mission period, like contact period reading is a little, you know, or knowledge is a little rusty. But like, isn't there a point during like the mission period when the Timucuan missions become really depopulated and they have to move people in basically to maintain them? Like, was Fig Springs like a prominent enough mission to have people moved into it? Because I know they tried to do that at like some of the more prominent missions, like river crossings on the St. John's. But
Yeah.
do you think that is maybe what's going on at Fig Springs?
I think that is what was happening. Now, Fig Springs was an early mission, pre-Timucuan Rebellion. It was there. We think that it was perhaps first a visita before it was a formal mission, and maybe the first priest or missionary shows up there in 1597. In 1608, it becomes a documented mission of San Martin de Timucua, and it becomes the central mission, the capital, so to speak, of the Timucua province. So yes, it was prominent. How soon the depopulation took place is an unanswered question. And to me, it seems like the archaeology is indicating there was some earlier movement coming in. And again, I can't date it precisely enough to say, you know, by 1623, this was happening and all. So I don't know. I think it's the larger depopulation supposedly occurred post-rebellion as the Spaniards were trying to repopulate the missions and sort of restart the mission province, the mission, the Camino Real, the mission chain going all the way from the coast to back to the Appalachia area. But most of our evidence here, archaeological evidence at the site is pre-rebellion, and I think the church was clearly burned and covered over, and that may have been the rebellion episode, the climatic episode right then. I don't know, but I would indicate I think you're on the right track. I think there was from an archaeological perspective, evidence of something going on that the documents didn't catch, because the documents are talking about government to government relationships, basically, or politician to politician, from a governor to a chief, and not getting down into the level of who was actually, the individuals living at the site. And of course, that's what archaeology excels at. So that you bring both data sources together and you come up with some new insights.
Any other questions? Ed, did you have a question?
Well, I think maybe I've stupefied everybody into a submission with the talk.
No, I think Ed has a question, but he's not, his
okay.
sound isn't working right. Did anybody else have any questions?
Not really a question, but I thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I wondered, with the shell-tempered ceramic with the applique rim, if you'd looked at walnut roughened from the Macon Plateau, which is, basically Seminole brush or Chattahoochee brush, but with a shell temper.
Yeah, we did look at walnut roughened, because we did have in part of this pre and early mission Aboriginal pottery that we think is genuinely Timucuan. We do have a brushed or a roughened pottery surface treatment that's very similar to walnut roughened, and it could easily, in my mind, have been a precursor to the creek brushed ceramics that become known as Chattahoochee brushed, and other types as well that the Seminoles have in Florida later on. So we do have that roughened or brushed surface treatment that has some prehistoric ancestry here that we did look at, not specifically with that Goggin series pottery, but we do have it as part of the Swanee series. I encourage you, if you're interested in that, to get my book. It came out in 1992. It's out of print as far as I know, but probably there are copies floating around on.
Yeah, you can order them online. I ordered a copy recently.
Okay, so I talk about and picture the pottery throughout, but John Worth has his own appendix at the end of the book, which he talks about it in some detail. So he's, as you know, a very credible, thorough, precise investigator. So he left no fleck of shell unturned in terms of.
Not unlike yourself, Brent.
Well, I like to think that, but so yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ed, go ahead.
Hey, Brent, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Brent, I bought your book some years ago and I haven't finished reading it. But from what I remember, the mission site is located on the east side of that blue hole sinkhole.
It's on the east side of Ichetucknee River. It's just a little bit south of Blue Hole. Yes.
A little bit south to the east side. Okay. Yeah. I'm was trying to remember.
Yeah. And the book isn't very long, so you should curl up with it and just finish it. And anyway.
I once visited Ichetucknee Springs back in '81.
Yeah.
I was 15 years old back then, so I had no interest or no knowledge of the Spanish history of Florida. So I once passed by, but I never noticed anything.
Yeah, well, I'm sure many people
excavated the site in '89. So
people float down the Ichetucknee in inner tubes. It's a big recreational destination. I'm sure most of them float right by there and have no idea, what took place, and that there was a thriving village right there on the shores of the Ichetucknee River. What I didn't talk about that I should have talked about a little bit more is the plant and animal remains that we found. Now, the diet was predominantly based on the river. Fish were the largest contributor to the biomass, also deer. But importantly, we had pig. So there was domesticated animals there. And in terms of crops, I talked about the corn, but we also had watermelon, we had peach, lots of peach. We had wheat seeds, which unusual, not often found. I mean, I'm not sure what the Appalachia situation is with wheat, but I think I'm pretty confident in saying it has not been found in other Timucua missions. So these are things that the priest had brought in to have the natives cultivate with that iron hoe to be producing food crops for the colony in St. Augustine. Yep. Thank you for your question.
Is it possible to visit the site? Is there some information or guided tours or something like that?
There's the Park
Historical
Service.
marker maybe?
The Park Service offers a guided tour. Like I said, they did pre-COVID. I don't know. They don't do it now. It's been suspended. I'm not sure when they're going to do it again. You could, if you know the river well, you would know where to pull in as you're canoeing or tubing down the Ichetucknee River, and you're right there at the site. There's not a public trail that goes back to it. I'm not sorry about that because there could be people poking around back there. But so unfortunately for the time being, guided tours have been suspended.
Well, thank you for explaining why there's no interpretive structures there, because as I'm reading through all the archives, there's all kinds of designs of how it was going to come to fruition, and I wondered. So that's very curious. They just sent the funding up to the mission, for which I'm grateful because that's where my facility is. And
yeah, and that's one of the things that happened with those early renditions of what an interpretive site would look like is the more work we did, the more it turned out that it wasn't supporting what the artists were drawing.
yeah.
So I had to keep saying, well, no, it's not, doesn't really look like that. So
Well, I think there's some conjecture that might be true even with the existing reconstructions at Mission San Luis, that the way they were interpreted isn't necessarily exactly how they looked, but
yeah,
what are you going to do?
That's always going to be an issue.
Right. I was wondering if, or you must be aware of the comparative mission archaeology portal that the University of Florida, a couple of the historical archaeologists created.
Yeah, I did. I have looked at it. Yes.
So Fig Springs is featured on that. If anybody is interested in taking a look at that, just Google CMAP, University of Florida, and it'll come up. And they actually still have the Fig Springs artifacts on loan that they borrowed to help create this website. And it's very interesting to get more information.
Yeah, and of course they have all the Goggin material because that was his repository at the time. It's 4,000 some objects that he collected from the spring.
Yeah. So does anybody else have any questions? Dana?
Thanks, Brent. I enjoyed hearing more about Fig Springs than I knew before. I just wanted to mention that about 5 or 6 years ago, I found 3 Ichetucknee black inlaid beads in my driveway. And I think we found the missing San Antonio de Timucua mission where my house sits.
Oh, that's pretty. That's very cool. Very cool.
I love the beads.
Yeah. So now I'm challenging you to think of those beads in a different way.
I will.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, I think that might be it.
All right.
Brent,
very good.
Thank you so very much. This was extremely enlightening. I truly enjoyed it. I was really looking forward to this, and you didn't disappoint. So I know it was a challenge to revisit all this, but I think I know that you are very proud of the work that you did there. You did fantastic work, and it still shows up in all those meticulous records that you took. That'll be there for future generations to go
Yes.
back. I know that is one of the problems. I think about that all the time, about archaeology destroying archaeological sites. But what's so important is that this work was so well done and so well documented, that there's still so much for future researchers to learn from it. So with that, I will wish everybody good night. And if we could give, and unmute yourselves, we could give Dr. Weisman a round of applause.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very much.
Thank
And
you.
if you will email me your address, I will be happy to send you, I don't know why I'm echoing, but a past t-shirt to thank you for your
Okay. Very good.
presentation tonight.
All right.
So we'll be in touch via email.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Marie?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. GA, did you have a question?
No, this is unrelated, but I was wondering, I'm not a member, but is it okay if I just like join the Zoom meeting every
Of
month?
course. Absolutely. We're happy to have you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
Hank, is
and it's-
GA on
it's
the,
still like-
is she on our mailing list?
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
you're muted,
yeah,
Hank.
mailing list. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she is. Yes.
Okay, great.
You're welcome
So-
anytime, GA.
Anytime. And
you.
just for everybody's information, each meeting is the same login information.
Yeah. Yeah.
We might change that in the fall, but through the rest of this year, it'll be the same. So we look
Right.
forward to hearing from you next month.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thank you very much.
All
and
right.
It was great to see you guys.
You too, GA. Take care.
right.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. See you next month.
Bye.